right. Is it all right if I move around a little bit? Yeah. Okay, good, because I'm going to be back visiting with people over there in a moment. You know, I am comfortable working a big room, but I was sort of psychologically prepared to sit in that cozy HU009 and just sort of smile at people to kind of make it through my presentation. So we could come up with all kinds of titles, but for the most part, my interest was in trying to do some research to understand more about the history of Salvadoran literature and to identify texts that might be really nice for us to try to use with our students here at MC. I'm a very practical person. So I want to start with a few questions because beginning to do this research was probably the hardest part of my preparing to come today. How many of you are familiar with Salvadoran writers? And I don't mean Salvadoran writers in the US, I mean Salvadoran writers. Okay. Who?
Brookie Dalton.
Dalton, of course. Anyone else?
Some poets whose names I don't remember.
Okay. Anyone else?
Alberto Masferrer.
Okay. He's definitely going to be part of my talk. Anyone else?
Ben Castro.
So, yes, and he's here now, sure. Anyone else? Okay. What about if I were to say Central American literature? You're going to be able to tell me that you know some other writers, so perhaps not in El Salvador, but say in Nicaragua? Okay, but the majority of people are illustrating one of the big problems for us, right? When people say, and the largest category, if you were to start trying to find out about this history, would be Latin American literature. But that, for the most part, has obscured or marginalized Central America. Right? So Latin American literature, if any of you were in college or graduate school in the 70s or 80s, you were like every week dying to pick up the latest translation of a work by an artist from Central or South America. It was a period that we call the Latin boom, right? And I'll mention some of the writers about that. I'll mention some of the writers from there in a little bit. But not one of those writers came from the Central America that we're talking about, right? So you had writers like Borges, Paz, Garcia Marquez, Fuentes, right? And later on, Allende. Yes, but in terms of thinking about El Salvador, no. It's not that people weren't writing, but it's to say that originally, the terms that were used that would have encompassed a history of Salvadoran literature were Spanish, right? Then Spanish American, then Latin American, and it's only been recently, it's only really been, say, in the last 2 decades that we actually have a term where we're specifically identifying Central American literature to pay attention to these countries close to the Isthmus, which have a lot in common, and also worked very hard to distinguish themselves from the tradition of, say, Mexican or Chilean or Peruvian writers. There's some other things to think about, though. I mean, do you think of, when I say, okay, a literary tradition, does it come to mind that, say, there would be a tradition that spans several hundred years of literature in El Salvador? My friend Jackie, how are you? I'm sorry. That's my buddy from when I worked in Rockville. Yeah. But does that come to mind? Because right now you're mentioning writers who are really from like the mid to late 20th century. So what about before that period? What's going on? We don't know. Okay. So there are a few challenges for us. One of them is, and I'm going to take 2 approaches here, and I am going to have to look at my notes a little bit just so that I'm economical with my time, as opposed to starting to tell you some stories to illustrate some of my points, which is what I ordinarily do when I'm teaching. But one of the things to think about is that in terms of the area where El Salvador is, these countries shared the countries of El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, Guatemala, they shared a very similar history all the way up until the present day. And in fact, as we learned from our talk last month with Jorge, there were 2 sort of political and cultural centers in this new Spain, right? In Mexico City and in Lima. And So the way that the literature was figured was really much larger regionally, right? It was sort of what was in the orbit of Mexico, which would have encompassed Central America, and then what was in South America, what would have sort of revolved around Lima. The other thing, of course, is that this history really privileges the Spanish part of it, right? So it leaves out what was going on before, and I don't like the term pre-Columbian, right, or pre-contact, because that definition really privileges, once again, as if like that was the most important moment in people's lives. It was a devastating, like very impactful moment, but there were thousands of years of tremendous civilizations, empires, and great culture. Lots of richness there. So on the other side of that, our challenge is that it's not until the early 1800s that these countries in Central America established themselves as nations. So for the most part, once again, they're really part of sort of this larger region, beginning to distinguish themselves because of a history of greedy landowners, right, who have displaced peasants, failed uprisings on the part of peasants to push those landowners away, waves of military dictatorships, shifting from Spain being sort of the dominant outsider to the United States being the dominant outsider, and then civil wars, right? And that's very different, obviously. I know enough of you know a bit about Mexico to know that's very different from the history of Mexico when we look at the late 1800s and we go into the 20th century. So we can't really have a national Salvadoran literature until we have the nation of El Salvador. But we have another problem, which is that the borders were very permeable. And that, in fact, when we look at the history of some of the key writers, even up to the generation of writers that you're mentioning, some people were born in Nicaragua but moved to El Salvador. Some people were born in El Salvador but moved to Nicaragua. And some people had parents from both countries and went back and forth. And a lot of us here, when we try to define a national literature, we're purists. It's like, you better be born in El Salvador, you better go on to the University of El Salvador, you better have lived your whole life in El Salvador before I'm going to say you're a Salvadoran writer. What's especially interesting is because of those porous borders, and also the reality that for the longest time, because of that Spanish dominance, the majority of people in El Salvador, the indigenous people and the peasants, could not have been an audience for this literature. They had no formal education, right? They were simply exploited for their labor and their land. And so the early writers of this time would have had patrons. And those patrons would have been people who were of Spanish descent and very much favored Spanish literary conventions. But at the same time, part of this movement toward nation building and ultimately independence spurred many writers who were creating protest literature. But there was, first of all, no publisher in El Salvador until we get to the middle of the 20th century who could have printed these pieces of writing. So we don't have a lot of remnants of these until we get to the early 20th century. People would have had to write this by hand and copy and distribute clandestinely, right? And there's a long history of the writers who achieved the most renown in El Salvador, either A, being tortured and or imprisoned and or murdered, or having to go into exile for the majority of their life, and occasionally coming back into the country to commune with fellow writers. But that's pretty challenging when you think about establishing a literary tradition. And you know, many people are familiar with the idea, the sense of how Europe deliberately underdeveloped many parts of the world. And even when we think about El Salvador today, while there are some publishing companies, they're generally small, and the reality is that there is a lot of poverty and there's still a lot of illiteracy, so the audience is limited in some respects to really support a burgeoning literary community. That doesn't mean there's not one, but it means it really eschews our traditional ideas about a national literature when we get to it. The other thing that's very interesting is that, you know, over 4 million people left Central America to come to the United States. And the thing that's most interesting for me, when we're talking about a definition, who's a Salvadoran writer, what is Salvadoran literature, is that people go back and forth. It's very much a transnational literature now, where people go back and forth between the United States and El Salvador. And there are plenty of writers who, for example, grew up in El Salvador, are based here, and there are plenty of writers who were born here and go to El Salvador as a way of returning and trying to connect with some of the indigenous traditions. So I'm almost done just presenting what are some of the challenges, right? So as you're researching, you have to look up lots of different terms, and you're always questioning. You find someone like, bingo, I got a great writer, I'm gonna go look at some of this, and then you're like, can I decide, is this person a Salvadoran writer? Right? Roque Dalton's a great example of that. He wasn't born in El Salvador, right? And in fact, his parentage even, some people later on were suspecting that part of why he could have been a traitor is that his dad was of Irish descent. And he was illegitimate, and his dad refused to recognize him as his son, right? So at any rate, so the other thing that's interesting is that what you have during and after the Civil Wars is also a sort of pan-Mayan activism that brings together people who shared the indigenous culture that was beyond those boundaries and are trying to resurrect the orature and the particularly Central American literary traditions that existed and flourished before the Spanish conquest. All right, so that's just a little bit in terms of the problems of figuring out about Salvadoran literature. Thoughts or questions so far? This is the condensed version. All right, I'm making sense? Yes, okay, all right, so we're understanding this. So the two approaches that I want to take are, one, I want to do sort of a literary perspective over several centuries up to where we are now, and the other is just from within aside El Salvador, an historical perspective. Those are the two different ways that people go, and I don't want to privilege one or the other because different things emerge when you look at that history from those two perspectives, right? So one of the things that's very interesting to think about is, of course, before European contact, there are very strong indigenous traditions, right? And for the most part, when we talk about that literature, we're talking about orature. So a tradition of people transmitting poetry and drama in particular, the two most popular genres in Latin American or Central American literature up until the 1800s are poetry and drama. Poetry and drama. And one of the reasons that I think that scholars have neglected Central American literature is because literary scholars really privilege novels. And the other is that in the 20th century, Central American writers excelled at short stories, which again, literary scholars who are generally snobby would look down and say, well, that's not a novel, you know, like that's not something big and real, you know, like that's just a little cheap something, right? When in fact, of course, the short stories are remarkable, and some of these writers have won Nobel Prizes based on the strength of their short stories. But still, this is another part to think about. So what do we have? Well, we have indigenous cultures that speak Nahuatl. That was spoken by the Aztecs in Mexico. There's also Maya, spoken in Mexico and Guatemala. Quechua, which is spoken in the Andean Incan Empire. And there are many other languages, and we have a vestige of that transmission of the orature in all of these different cultures. But we also know that the Nahuatl who were in Mexico and the peoples, the Pipil and the Huaracha, who are the native peoples in El Salvador, speak a variation on a Nahuatl language, that we know that we have records of how there were pictographic codices where people wrote down, you know, they put their literature on either leather or paper that was made from tree bark. And we have that. Like, there's no shortage of that, all right? It's also interesting that some of the kings of these early empires, they were like the leading literary figures, right? And so occasionally they wrote epics where they were like, yeah, this is why I'm the king, right? But they also did their best to create a culture that was something that was very important to them in terms of establishing what they regarded as a truly advanced civilization. And so we have that. And then we also have, for the Maya, in Central America, we have what we call this ideographic or phonetic system that people used. And once again, they created these paper codices, whether it was from bark of different kinds of plants, or they also carved it into stone. And there's plenty of this too. I mean, I could have done a whole slideshow, right? So there was a long oral and written literary tradition before the Spanish show up. I think Jorge made very clear last month that the first aim of the Spanish was to make sure that they completely repressed or obliterated any indigenous culture or traditions. And so what we have is in the 1500s, most of the writers who are in an area that would include El Salvador, they were born, educated in Spain, and they were here on a temporary sojourn. And some of them were conquistadors, and they wrote great, what they basically did was they revised history, right? Everything started with them, and it was all from their perspective. And I say this because when we talk about what's happening in contemporary Salvadoran literature, we are returning, we're visiting, we're going way back. We're not going back to like the generation before. We're going back 500 years to fix that problem, right? We know that some of the fathers and some of the priests who were alongside doing their work, right, with these conquistadors and other explorers, they also, wrote records. For the most part, these were histories. And their histories are mixed, as you know. Anyone who's looked at De las Casas and his account of, for example, Columbus's first encounter off Hispaniola with the Arawak Indians, it's mixed. He's describing them as beautiful and friendly and generous people, right? But he believes in the superiority of Columbus and Europeans. So we get some facts, but right? Somewhat skewed in favor of the Europeans. And of course, these Spanish writers, whether they were the people who came to explore and conquer and basically like make money in whatever way they could, as well as these missionaries, most of the work that they were writing, in some ways, it was either sort of journalistic in a way, and it was very polemical. So it didn't really have kind of, when we think about literature, it's not something that many of us would go back and say, oh yeah, I definitely want to show that to my students in English 190. Yeah. And then what happens in the 1600s is that we begin to have writers who are born in the Americas, but their whole cultural base still is Spain. So they may be born here, they're not able to be educated necessarily where they're based in Central America, although they could go to some of the emerging universities that, again, are in those areas that the Spanish had established in Mexico and Peru. But some of them go back to Spain for their education, and then they come back, and they're the ones that many people look back and say, well, those are the first sort of, native, potentially Salvadoran writers. Now, at this time, the most popular style was the Baroque. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. When I say that word, does it conjure up any images for you? You might think of it more often with architecture. What is Baroque like? Wicked, yes, sort of like too much Trump Tower. All right, that's the best way to think of it. Too much Trump Tower, and so these writers came back and they went beyond the Baroque tradition in Spanish literature, right? They wanted to. Their thing was like, now we're in Central America, and they wrote this like way piled on all this fancy business for their contribution to this particular period. But it's also interesting. So it's interesting, once again, though, one of the most famous writers from this period is in Mexico, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, right, who's foremost known as a poet and then a playwright, right? She's not quite as ornate, but that's probably why we still look at her writing, as opposed to the other people who were creating around this time. And then in the 1700s, we have something called the Enlightenment and Neoclassicism. And the interesting thing here is that the writers for this era, they are all born and based in the Americas, right, in Central and South America. And some of them go back to Spain for their education, but some of them are educated or informally educated in the Americas and writing. They're still looking to some Spanish traditions. But the thing that's interesting is, instead of writing texts where they're basically trying to transplant Spain or like be nostalgic about Spain, now the landscape for their literature and the references are they're all indigenous, right? That's sort of like they want to emulate Spanish style, but everything's happening here. And that's an important change up, right? So some people say, well, that's the beginning of what could be, you know, Central American literature. I'm going to push it a little further. Then in the 1800s, you have Romanticism. And it is just what it sounds like, all right? So if you're romantic, right? If you're romantic, then, and you're going to put that into your writing, what you going to be like? Wicked emotional, right? Wicked emotional, very, very passionate. So what's interesting here is that this is the beginning. It also coincides with the beginning of these countries establishing themselves as nations. We have a lot of literature which borrows European Romanticism, but it is starting to really express a lot of passion about the indigenous people, right? About the indigenous landscape. And this is important because this is a tradition that will continue on into that committed generation where people are just like, I'm so in love with you, El Salvador, right? That it's almost a little bit much, right? It's almost a little bit much. Now, the other thing that's interesting is what's shifting, remember where the cultural centers were Mexico and Peru, now that the Spanish, they're kind of withdrawing from the picture, what's interesting is you have what I would call, and I don't mean this in terms of their significance, but in terms of their geography, these peripheral areas like Cuba and the southern tip of South America really become the prominent cultural centers in this period, right? And I'm sure everybody here, you may not be able to tell me the names of a lot of Cuban writers, but you know there's an extraordinary artistic tradition in Cuba that was going strong for hundreds of years. So what's interesting here is we still have a lot of poetry and we have a lot of drama, but it's the beginning of having novels as well. And I guess the thing to say here is that many countries now had established their national boundaries. So I mean, the things went hand in hand with Romanticism and to celebrate, your nation and to kind of go back and celebrate what was authentic to your nation before the Spanish were here. All right. Trying to move quickly through, but just to kind of give you an idea of how the literature is shaped. And then, for a brief time at the end of the 1800s, we have something called realism and naturalism. And what's interesting here is the biggest explosion of literary expression actually comes from Peru, Colombia, Uruguay, Chile, and they wrote about the people and conditions that were specific to their nations, right? And oftentimes the rest of the world, when they looked to the area, basically they took all these people up not as national writers, but as regional writers, despite their geographic specificity. But what's also interesting at this time is, people were kind of looking back to Spain, and all of a sudden people are like, this is part of becoming a nation. They're like, screw Spain. Now, I'd like to say, well, they completely went cold turkey on European everything. That's not true. But they fell in love with and emulated the French writers and the Scandinavian writers, my people, right? Now, I'm not, but there was a different inflection on this literature in each of these periods that was coming from France and from Scandinavia as opposed to Spain. But this was part of establishing a literary independence. We're going to take our influences where we want, but we're not going to take them from the place that colonized us. And this is the beginning in many parts of Latin America of the establishment of more universities, publishing houses, literary journals. When we think about some of the figures from this time, I would say the two most prominent cities, though, were Mexico City and Buenos Aires. And when we think about writers from this period, we have, for example, Jose Marti from Cuba. I think most people are familiar with that name. Rubén Darío from Nicaragua. And we also have, interestingly enough, the first Latin American writer who wins the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1949. It's a woman, which is another thing that's very exciting when we look through the tradition, right? I can go back for every 100 years and I can find some of the major figures who were widely respected by all of the population were women, which is neat because we didn't get that in the American literary tradition that was presented to us as we were coming of age as scholars, right? Does anyone know who won that? Who was the first Latin American writer to win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1949? No, I wish, but she wasn't quite in her prime yet. Gabriela Mistral. Right, and what's interesting here is to notice, and I'm familiar with her, there are a few of the big women who emerged, you know, from Latin America in this period, like Maria Luisa Bombal and Luisa Valenzuela. What was interesting for them was that they, by moving away from Spain and moving toward France and Scandinavia, they became very experimental in their style. And what you see is really that early on then, Central American or Salvadoran literature was always transnational. It was always global. People were always open to, you know, being inspired by and exchanging their work with people all over the world, which is wonderful, right? Because many countries, part of establishing a national literary tradition is to be extremely closed-door, extremely ethnocentric. So I'm also pointing out in my knowledge of literary traditions what's special about this, what's kind of fun. The other thing that we have is there's a big rise in historical treatises, cultural studies, political commentary. And as I said, when people think about literature that they appreciate, they don't generally think of that. Next, this is the precursor to like the big period, all right? The period where I could like talk for quite a long time. But the next period is what we call vanguardism. And when you say vanguard, what do you mean by that? If somebody's part of the vanguard, what are they? At the forefront, at the cutting edge, right? At the cutting edge. What was happening at this time that would have said to people like, just screw all the old stuff, right? In fact, we're kind of lost and we don't know what's going to happen next. What was going on at the turn of the 20th century and up after that? From the perspective of people in Central America, right? Because in the United States, we have our own sort of perspective on like what's important, what's going on. Well, we had what? The Mexican Revolution. We had World War I. We had the Russian Revolution. And so what happened was those particular events really spurred people to kind of let go of any literary ties and to become ever more experimental. And in the case of most of these writers, what they wanted to do was they wanted to try to go back and they wanted to try to they wanted to go and find people who could teach them some of the indigenous languages so that they could start using this vernacular in their writing. That's pretty radical because that already limits your audience in some ways, right? And the other is that they really wanted to make as the touchstones of the references in their literature things that were native to their particular countries. Which again, when you think about if you got to give somebody a glossary for a book, unfortunately, some people are like, nah, that's too much work. I'm not doing that, right? But for other people, be like, cool, I kind of want to enter this world. But this was an interesting period. And then you have, of course, the Cuban Revolution, right? And in this period, we have writers who are published, and the interesting thing is writers from Latin America who are published in French and Spanish, right? Which is also unique. You don't really see that coming out of particular national tradition. And it's interesting, of the two branches, one which is the experimental, and then there's one that really starts moving toward resurrecting these ancient traditions, right? We have these two different ones. So the first one, a good example, would be Borges from Argentina, and the other would be Neruda from Chile, who won the Nobel Prize in 1971. Anyone familiar with Pablo Neruda? Experimental is kind of mild, right? Yeah? Okay. So we have this going on. And then you also have the example, for example, one of my favorite writers from Cuba is Nicolas Guillen, who really resurrects what he calls an Afro-Antillean, right? Like an African, Caribbean aesthetic, right? So this is an exciting time. And then finally, what we have as we move into, get close to 1950, which is the beginning of like the real, like solid, like we got a Salvadoran literature tradition, big time, is we have a focus on regional novels and short stories, and people are starting to write about the revolutions in their respective nations. They're writing about the conflict between tradition and modernity, which is expressed for the rural and the urban areas, right? And Also writing a lot more about like sort of not romanticizing, but writing in a more historical journalistic way about the history of the indigenous peoples. All right. There's also the development of different kinds of genres that are specific to a particular nation. So like in Argentina, you have this tradition called the gaucho novel. Anyone know what a gaucho is? Is a cowboy, right? Okay, that's a big part of it, right? And you also have this tradition called the dictator novel. Want to guess where? You want to guess? There's quite a few countries that could, celebrate this. But I mean, if you go and you look in a book about literature and you look up genres, you ain't going to see the gaucho novel. You're not going to see like dictator novel. But these are like, really kind of indigenous genres that are created. And it goes without saying that, of course, there are other genres that people go back to from the past that they create. All right. So here's the big deal, the biggest period, right? The biggest period is 1945 to 1995. And still, poetry and drama, and then also the essay, those are the favored genres. It's not that people aren't writing novels, right? But when I say again about how people would or would not have, randomly pulled some books off the shelf from, say, El Salvador, it depends on whether they like poetry or drama or they like essay. But as I said, a lot of people, when they think about literature, they think about novels. And what we had was, this was the beginning of the Latin boom, the explosion, right? Which was happening really from everywhere in Central and South America. And what's interesting is, of course, so you had these people who were experimental, right? And what they were doing was very much like when we talk a lot about people who are postmodern or deconstructionist, where in some ways they kind of question the very act of reading and writing. Right? Like they're just kind of saying like, really, does anything have meaning, right? Like, and what's the point of this in different ways? But the other thing is, in El Salvador, what we have is more people who are moving away from experimental into a very journalistic style, a very historical style, and they are very much trying to incorporate then the Pipil and the Caliche, right? The two native peoples who were part of what becomes El Salvador. And I should say, does anybody know what the original name for what becomes El Salvador was? And what, in my research, evidently, many Salvadorans hold on to. Cuscatlan. Cuscatlan. And Salvadorans call themselves Cutzla. Say that louder because my pronunciation's terrible. Cuscatlecos, right, right. And so what you see is people are going back and finding that out, right? And they're starting to use different names to refer to people in this area. This is something that's very specific to El Salvador, all right? And the other thing that happens is magical realism, okay? That's why a lot of people love the Latin boom. What is magical realism? We are smiling, right? Because it's great. What is magical realism? Does anyone know?
It's typical. Gabriel Garcia Marquez was one who wrote a lot in that style, and he said everything I wrote is true, but it involves a lot of fantastical kind of imagery.
Right. So you have to suspend disbelief, right? And he kind of works seamlessly, as do many writers, between what you could accept, like this is real, like I can be here and this can happen, versus what's a little bit like otherworldly, right, or supernatural in some way. Interestingly enough, magical realism is not something that really takes off in El Salvador. Anyone want to think about, first of all, why many Latin American writers developed this genre of magical realism and why writers in El Salvador would not really get into it? And after the revolution, they're like, hell no. No magical realism is allowed in a Salvadoran book. Want to try it?
I want to just give it a try. To attempt to reconstruct history in a way that begins to own it again.
And incorporates some of the beliefs of the indigenous people pre-Christianity. That's a very important aspect of it, right? What's interesting is people look at it and they say, oh, it's ultra-modern. Well, it's also ultra-ancient, right? And that's the part that I like a lot. But yeah, in El Salvador, that was not really what people were into so much. Instead, what we have is something called the committed generation, right? And most of the writers that you mentioned came out of that period. And I'm going to talk specifically about a few of them in a moment. But when you hear that term, committed generation, right, what does that make you think? Y'all quite back there. I'm sure I'm boring you. But if somebody's committed, what do you think that means? Committed. What does it mean, committed? Huh?
Well, my first thought was mental illness.
Oh, okay. Well, there's no doubt that people experienced PTSD, and like they did have a lot of psychological issues.
But also like that obligation.
Yes, right. So very quickly there were sort of rules. Basically, if you were going to be an artist in El Salvador, there's two ways to go. You can be somebody who is not committed to the indigenous people, this history of struggle, like taking down repressive dictators, right? And ultimately coming out on the other side of civil war with a unified and peaceful and thriving nation, right? So your writing has to be explicitly political. And if you're not part of that, there was a really fun quote that I read, but basically you're an ivory tower escapist and you should go to the United States, right? So when we think a little bit about it, that has an impact on these particular writers. Oh my gosh, okay, I gotta wrap up quickly, I'm running out of time, but I'll show you this thing here. And perhaps people have questions. So this is very important. All right. I'm going to just show you something about this committed generation. And as I said, I could talk a little bit more if we have time later for questions about, let me see if I can do my thing right here with the document camera. You can do it. Okay, good. All right. Picture's all right. It's a little bright, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to fuss with it too much. The committed generation, the person who really begins establishing this is a man named Italo Lopez Verecillos. And in fact, the handout that I passed out gives you a little bit of, information about the writer for some of these folks, right? So you have pre-committed generation, and these are writers who are very, very important. But when you turn the page, you have the committed generation. And some of the books that I most liked when I was doing some reading have not been translated. So you have this handout. No, I gave some to Deb. Right, because this is for you, if you want to go on and start reading something. So the pre-committed generation, and they overlap the committed generation, but the committed generation, you have Claribel Alegría, right? You have Manlio Argueta, you have Roque Dalton, you have Horacio Castellanos Moya, and then Valecidos, who didn't write any short stories or novels to speak of, but he was instrumental as an historian and a journalist. And I think the important thing to say about these guys, knowing that I have very little time left to finish, is to tell you that in terms of these big figures, right, that someone like Roque Dalton, everybody here seems to have heard of him, right? And we're going to see his poetry like inscribed everywhere in El Salvador. What's the irony for him? He's celebrated now, but guess what? He was killed at a young age. Why? By his own crew, by his own literary circle at the University of San Salvador. Why? Does anyone know? Yeah, they thought he was a traitor. Does anyone know why? Part of the thing is, of course, that Dalton, he spent so much time around the world, right? And some of these other people who were part of his literary circle, they were sort of stuck in El Salvador, right? But the other part, in terms of thinking a little bit more about his life, and what's interesting here is because in some ways he shifted some of his beliefs, right? So he had a parochial education. He was very much steeped in the Catholic tradition and attracted in some ways to the Catholic idea of liberation theology, right? Like Ernesto Cardenal from Nicaragua. But on the other hand, he also was attracted to Marxism, right? As were many of the people in his literary circle. And one of the things that happened is he continued to sort of gravitate towards certain writers outside of El Salvador, and it seemed like in some ways that he wasn't sort of loyal to this literary circle and to El Salvador. And he was very prosperous in other parts of the world where he went. He lived for a long time in Cuba, for example. He was in France. He was in Spain. He was in Portugal. But essentially, the last thing to say, I guess, is that I think some people were resentful of him because he was published and recognized as a professional writer more than the other people in this literary circle. And there was a little suspicion because he had been imprisoned twice when he was in El Salvador, and he managed to break out one time, which was a cause célèbre, and people were wondering how did he manage to do that, right? Because nobody else had managed to be able to do that before. And eventually he renounces Marxism, right, which people are still holding on to, and he sort of moves toward an idea of socialism. And I think that it's all of those and then he disappears, right? So some people may know. He disappears in the early 1970s. At one point he's in Chile, at one point he's in Vietnam. And he sneaks back into El Salvador in 1973, but this guerrilla group that involves this literary circle decides that, well, either A, he's not committed enough, or B, that maybe he's infiltrating them in some way because he's been shifting his political ideology. And so he's murdered just before his 40th birthday. But you know, we have that experience in this country, right, where people who are considered enemies, now we have monuments to them. All right. I wish I had more time to talk to you about some of these writers, but if you do have a chance, if you were to look at the description of some of these books, I think you'd find like, wow, they're great, because I've read quite a few of them. And again, like I said, if there's more time for questions. The other thing that I gave you was a poem that came from an anthology I will pass around of the books that you could get, which would give people sort of a buffet of Central American writers. The Wandering Song, and it's listed on the last page of your handout there. 32 of the excerpts in here are by Salvadoran writers who either were born in El Salvador or here. And I gave you a poem that I like by Quique Aviles, who is based here. I was going to show you one of his video performances. He's awesome, but I give you the hyperlinks for those as well. So I'm going to have to stop right here. I apologize I didn't get through everything, but at any rate, that's a little taste of it. Okay. All right. I'm also going to pass around one of the things that I put on the back of that. I'm involved with Teaching for Change. Anyone heard of this organization in DC? Right? So I printed out for you, there's two different slides, and these are great introductions to Central America and also to Central American history and literature. So I'll pass it around if you want to look at these, but you have the hyperlinks. All right. And my last goodie, my two favorite books about art from Central America, right? Murals, I love. So we've got the Mexican muralists and the murals of revolutionary Nicaragua. And as far as I know, there's no one book dedicated to El Salvador. But I'm looking forward to seeing some gorgeous murals when we go there. So I'll pass these around if you want to look through some of them. They'll go each way, and take your time. Thank you for your patience.
Well, I also wish that Ellen would keep going. That was incredible. So while I'm setting up here, I'm very clumsy with the technology. I have a little task for you. Since we're really talking about cultural identity through various different perspectives, I'd like everybody to take a little card here, since we're a community. And the first thing I'd like you to do is to ask each other who can name all the countries of Central America. I guess I should count Belize, but you can set that one aside, all that English. And I'd like you to just jot down, no?
They'd be hurt.
Oh. Okay, so I'd like you to just jot down everything that comes to mind when to answer the question, what is culture? What is culture anyway? We're always talking about it. It's going to be central to the art and literature that I'm going to talk about. And it's pretty much what makes us tick, basically. You know, it sounds kind of, you know, culture. You have culture. Thank you. And we have options, different colors, okay? I don't know if colors do it for you, but they do for me. So Yes, we're going to start with that. One of the things that I really loved about getting started with this program to El Salvador, which for me was like a dream come true. It's like, oh my God, we can go to El Salvador. This was really exciting to me. But I didn't really know what the framework was going to be exactly. So Rita is, she's kind of our framework here. She has to take all of this sort of dynamic energy of all of her projects, and I think with Ellen, it's a great example. You get the idea of intensity and passion and so forth. Rita has to harness all of this so that we can put this together and be resources for each other. And my gosh, I wish you could just keep going. It just gives me goosebumps. Yeah.
Well, I want to say that the thing that's great is it just, in starting on that, I just found so much that I now want to share with students. And that's awesome because it's hard to make time for that. So being forced to prepare something for here got me to do a little professional development that I'll be able to use.
I'll just add that when we come back, you get to create teaching materials.
Exactly.
So we are...
Yeah, that's exactly what's happened. We were given the option to, or we were given the task of coming up with a project that we were interested in. And what I like what Rita said, she said, now when you present, I want you to think about what would you like us to know about this topic? And that was really helpful to me. Because I wanted to think, well, what is, when I come at this project, what's the most important thing to me? I have a kind of dual interest. They sort of merge together, and that's art and literature. I don't really make a separation between the two because I see the visual images in art, and I'll use a painting for an example so that you can picture the frame and you can picture what the artist has chosen to put into that limited space, okay? The same thing is true when you, and I'm going to use a poem as an example, because for me, poetry is the most intense form of language. So you have the images, visual images that are within the painting, within that frame, and then you have the visual images that are in that poem, okay? So for me, they're sort of the same language. And I wanted to find what's the piece that I can share with you in terms of El Salvador and the art and literature, and then more broadly from Central America. That's kind of my main focus. I'd like to tag on to what Ellen said in terms of like graduate school and sort of the things that we read and the things that influence this particular project that I have. Because it's kind of an ongoing event for me. It's just, you saw her passion, this is what does it for me. I could be all night long doing this if we had. But, and this is going to be very challenging for me to keep everything together for 20 minutes, because what happens is my imagination with these visual images and language, she says something and then all these things sprout up, right? So I'm going to have to try to pull in to give you the piece that for me is the most important part of this project. I had pictured a blackboard behind me because I'm most comfortable. I'm better at coordinating my ideas if I have either a paintbrush or a pen in my hand. So pretend like there's an easel here and we're going to put things there. That will help me bring it in. So on my blackboard, I was going to write you a big circle, okay, and I'd like to talk about the tensions that we bring into this project of El Salvador and the larger region of Central America, and a way that I would like you to, in many ways like Ellen did, a sort of backdrop for us to put this new information into. And for me, when you talk about art and literature of Central America, and Latin America, I should say, we're thinking in terms of, I want to make the starting point 1492. Okay, let's think of that. And here, that's sort of like a castle. Okay, you remember Isabel y Fernando and their castle. You can go to Toledo, you can see it, where they made the decision to send Columbus off on his way. Okay, so that's kind of a starting point. Then you have a ship. Okay, you have, that's my little boat. And so he's going off, and they're going to discover what? Okay, as if there's really nothing else there. So you take all of these traditions, all of this history, and we're moving it over to a new area. Okay, but at the same time that we have this castle, sort of representing the powers that be in Spain, at the same time, at the other side, we have the gorgeous temples and the sacred places, and also where daily life took place on the other side of the world. And this was equally powerful. So this is what we're bringing together, okay? I'd like to do one more thing. Do I have a pen? I need that black.
Here.
I need a big one, a thick one, sorry.
Oh, you have it right there.
Oh, thank you. See what I mean? Okay. So, from here, we're just going to do that. Is that how you make a dollar sign? I don't even know. Okay. So, I want to talk for a bit about the idea of culture and what the conquistadores were actually bringing with them, okay? And so on this sail here, you can imagine the crown, and they're going off to do their business off in the hinterlands. And what's the motivation? It's money, okay? Whatever you call it, oro, plata, gold, silver, the plunder. Okay, that's really what we're talking about here. There were other parts of their ambition, and you see right here in the middle, what's this? That's a cross. Okay, so supposedly they're going with their religion. They're going to what? Help the heathens, those little wild, reckless people that they might encounter. They're going to have to convert them. Okay. So you have several ambitions. You have the religion that's already established. They've now gotten rid of the Arab culture, right? And so now they're moving over, and Columbus is coming with his boat over here, and he gets to another side. Okay, then we look at the temple. Maybe some of you have been to the Mayan temples or the Aztec, Tenochtitlan, and so forth, or Machu Picchu on the other end. But they come, and there is a Mayan civilization already thriving, okay, very, very advanced civilization. And so we have a different kind of ambition. And I've tried to kind of represent this here. Okay, so this is the moon, and these are stars, okay? So I want you to imagine the religion that was already there, and the ambition that's there is in a different way, okay? Instead of looking to the cross and the religion from that perspective, you have the priests and so forth that are looking to the universe, looking to the skies, and the culture is based on more than money, right? There's power associated, but so we have a conflict, okay? So what I would like to suggest with this as a backdrop for the art you're going to see and for the literature we'll talk about, that this is a set of tensions, okay? And tension is going to be kind of the focus of this, that these two things never really go away. There's constantly tension, okay? Just because the Spanish arrived, they're not suddenly, all of that influence is not going to just disappear. So when we talk about art and literature, that will be a certain kind of presence. We already saw an example of this tension. We've had some really wonderful presentations so far. We've had outside speakers, and we had, I always forget his first name, Lindolfo Carballo, and he presented the university system in El Salvador and how it played into daily life. Okay, so what happens? You have constant tension. He said the university was founded in, what, Evelyn, the late 1800s, I think. It's been there very, very long time. And he showed us how the university changed hands back and forth. The military would come into power, and so that freedoms were constantly being challenged. And so that's one side of it. Then you had, besides Lindolfo Carballo, we had Jorge Hernandez Fujigaka, I think is his last, Fujigaki, okay? And Jorge told us about some of the history and politics of Latin America in terms of cultural identity, okay? And we know that what happened, by the time that boat got over to the Americas, what happened? One of the first places they came, 1492, Columbus actually arrived in, not first, he went to the, I think, Bahamas first. He landed in Cuba, right? So we can imagine this powerful influence getting closer and closer, and finally they've landed. And what happens first? The S word. Okay, the guys get off the boat. Oh, there's nice looking women, and so forth. And now we have mestizaje. From there on, you have this constant, actually mixing of identities, because you have a Hispanic heritage, or coming over from Spain, and then you have your Latin American identity, and those mix. And he showed us some visuals. Okay, so now while I switch over, okay, we're going to move from here over to the PowerPoint, so you can compare your notes. Okay, what is culture to you in your mind? And see how many things you come up with. Okay, so those little notes that you just wrote down, what is culture to you? Okay, some of you might recognize this. Okay, I hope to find out what you came up with about culture. But some of you might recognize this, this engraving that was from an earlier project with the Smithsonian Faculty Fellowship. And one of the, I love this because the engraving, because it shows one of the big ships and how there really was a lot of interaction going on. Okay, so you can imagine these ships. They're pulling into, say, the Cuban harbor. Okay, now we've established that as a point of contact, and after that, everything broke loose. Okay. And here we have Cuba. Okay, you have the harbor in Cuba. I was in Cuba in June, and this was taken from one of their little, they called it restos arqueológicos, because they're very proud of the heritage of having built the wall, try to keep all the goods for themselves. The English and the pirates are coming and trying to invade, so they built this huge wall around the harbor, okay, as far as they could. And then over here we have, Ellen mentioned Jose Marti, okay, the independence hero of Cuba, and also very much a literary man. He went to the US, spent time as a journalist, and he came back, and we know the rest of the story there. By the way, I just learned today from one of my student presentations that Cuba is 99.9% literate, the literacy rate. Oh, yeah. Okay? All right. So just as a reminder that now we've come over to here. Okay, and now we're looking at an image from about 200 years later, approximately, 1520, 1720 is when this was done. Okay, and so here you have an example of the mixing of cultures, de mestizo y de India, produce coyote. So all of these different mixes, say your first arrival of the Spanish and then mix with the indigenous woman, or however that worked, and all of the various shades and combinations, I have no idea how many there could be. Well, they had names for them, and this was a way of, instead of just wiping everybody out, you could begin to build your population, because of course they just came over with a few boats of guys. Okay, so this is kind of where things started. And this would be a form of art, actually, during that period. Okay, so there are actually many forms of art already present. This is an incredibly beautiful piece of pottery from El Salvador, actually. It was found in the area of Joyas de Serén. Okay, so just to remind us that there was already art present, incredible art. And this was an exhibit at the the Smithsonian Museum of the American Indian, okay? And this is the Popol Vuh, okay, sacred Mayan text. And I show you this to remind you that there was already literature, okay? Way before there were English departments, those so important English departments in the US, there was American literature, okay? Most of the tradition was oral, but there were also written texts, and most of them, the Spanish did their best to burn as much as they could, so we unfortunately don't get to see much. But, okay. Then we have, okay, El Popol Vuh, is what it's called. And the really neat thing about, the Popol Vuh is it's a story of how the gods Tepeo and Gucumatz got together to populate the world. They're going to make a world. And there's not just one god who makes all the decisions and says, this is what you're going to do, and this is what I tell you. These gods got together, and they would have conversations. They would create some beings. They're aiming towards human beings. And the first round, there were men of clay, and I say men, okay, just go with that for a minute. Men and women of clay and of wood and so forth. But they would go through all these stages, and they were never quite satisfied because some of the beings really had no heart because they were made of wood or clay, they were kind of dumb and so forth. And they finally end up with the humans that come from corn, which is soft and malleable and gives you nutrition and so forth. So I love the idea that in the literature you have gods that have a dialogue, and they are critical of the culture, okay? And so we can always do better as humans. So this is part of the major original literature. Okay, and here you have some scribes. This is taken from a Maya codex, okay? Most of the stuff was destroyed, but here's a few. And I love it, it said the scribal god, okay? So there was actually a god of writing, okay? And this is probably my favorite, because what we have is a female scribe. And this is always what I'm looking for when I'm looking at literature. What were the women saying? What were the women writing? And I think it's a really beautiful example that there aren't just male writers, okay? And there were gods, okay, that here we have the god of fire, and this figure is from El Salvador, okay? It's like a pottery vase, okay, and I think that was made, they say, in AD 900 to 1200. Another example of art already present. Okay, and here we get to Vincent's Volcano, Cultural Identity in Central American Art and Literature. A lot of what we're doing in our trip to El Salvador and what we're trying to learn about Central America, more specifically El Salvador, it's student related. What we're doing, we're trying to bring students into this. And Gloria Bonilla, who is in our group, she told us recently about a presentation of what they called artist books, okay? Artist books. And this is an artist book by a young man named Vincent from Guatemala. You see his volcano back there, volcanoes. The students are ESOL students in a couple of local high schools. They have just arrived. They're just beginning high school. Most of them speak no English, so you can imagine they've come to the U.S. under duress. And one of the projects was for them to narrate their experience, and you can imagine traumatic experience through the visual arts, okay? So Vincent, this young man, not each person, they selected a few students to present their art, okay? And the art had writing, a lot of it was also a book. And this is Vincent's. So Vincent came from Guatemala. I'm not using his last name, but his name actually was Vincent. And I loved, because it made me think of who? Vincent van Gogh, okay, who was neglected during his time, but ended up to be a very important, he had very important things to express about the world. And I felt that way about Vincent. These books were set up over in Tacoma Park at one of the libraries. And so I had to take pictures from different angles so you don't really get the best view. But this was a phenomenal book. And I love the idea that for Vincent, the volcano, that massive power that comes from the land, that was his central image. So here's, and he really couldn't speak English, but notice the detail he's got in the corn. It goes back to the land, the corn. And one of the other issues that I'd like to mention is the idea of educations being interrupted that we have during the Civil War in El Salvador. You have all those lives whose educations are interrupted. And here is Vincent, okay? And he's narrated a whole series of drawings about his experience leaving Guatemala, okay? Just to give you an idea of some of the graphic images here. And then he's got, this is the scene of death, and I asked him, did someone die? I didn't ask him any more than that, but I just wanted to clarify. But just for his privacy, that's all we did. More volcanoes. And this is on one side of the book, there's 16 panels. And on one side, he has figures. So this is a young man who has just immigrated. And this is a close-up. You can see part of the pattern, geometric pattern of his book. And he told me that when he was at home, he would run through the trees, through the paths in the trees, and he just sort of lit up when he talked about this. He was very shy, okay? So he was very happy. So you have the image of being alone, but one of the good things that he's taking with him, that he's bringing, is his memory of the land and nature. Okay. And it gives you a little bit better idea of the beauty of the book. Honestly, it was just stunning. And again, I had to work with, so his sense of graphic art, and like Vincent van Gogh, I'm going to use that as a reference, we think of someone who lived, he was really neglected during his lifetime. Okay, and you see the plane taking off, all of these images of leaving, and on the other side you have human figures that are suffering. Okay, I want to go back for a second to a text. Okay, I'm going to include here, thinking about children like Vincent. This is from Monsignor Oscar Romeros, who is a central figure, as you all know, in El Salvador during the Civil War, the martyr. And this is something that one of the readings that we had, I just separated this out from the liberation theology, just to kind of give you, I think it tells us what that was about. And so keeping Vincent in line. Option for the Poor, that was the section. And he also sent this message to Jimmy Carter at the time to make him realize that people were suffering. So we must not seek the child Jesus in the pretty figures of our Christmas cribs. We must seek him among the undernourished children who have gone to bed tonight with nothing to eat, among the poor newsboys who will sleep covered with newspapers in doorways. Okay, so some of the pictures that Vincent drew on the back side, some of the human figures, were groups of children sitting outside kind of waiting for their movement to the US. So just to incorporate Monsignor. Okay. I'm going to also divide this into a gallery, so I'm not going to keep talking. Okay. Here was another artist book, and I love this. Just to give you an idea of some of the talent that's actually there that could be easily lost. if we aren't paying attention. I think this is great. This is where we're going. And you can see that sort of sense of joy in his country. This young man, I don't have his name, and the reason, Vincent allowed me to use his name, but we didn't use last. We don't want to give the last name because some of these children can be persecuted by family members that are already established here. There are complications. So for that reason, there's no name. Otherwise, there would be. Okay, but I love how lively it is, all the colors, it's very positive. And off on the corner, you can see a place where children can play. This is his image of coming to the US. Okay, unfortunately, you can only see it from a weird angle, but I love his idea of, he's got the flag, okay, and we have our monument, okay, represents our country, and then he has the United States written there, okay, but really significant difference in the feeling of the imagery. And then this is the next page, okay, carrying on, and what represents the U.S.? A big old house, okay, and I love the graphics, okay, and what is featured here? Okay, everything's kind of cockeyed and a little threatening there, right? A big old house with a car in the garage. That's his impression coming to the U.S. This is our country. Flashback to the El Salvador picture. I think it tells us something. Okay. Part of my project is to find out about women writers in Central America. So one of the first places I turned was Consuelo Hernandez, which is she's a poet from Colombia who teaches at American University. She's a very good poet, and so I trusted her in saying, could you tell me something about writers that you know? So this is a work that you could use this as a reference as well. There weren't a lot of women in it, but it's a very good background for writing, okay? So this is Consuelo Hernandez, and she's right here locally. Okay? And here she is. Okay, that's Consuelo at the Maratón de Poesía. It was a one-week event that we hold in Washington, D.C. with Spanish-speaking poets really from all over. And one of the things that Consuelo took a trip to El Salvador. She went, it was a conference, Cien Voces con Monseñor, the 14th festival, the International Festival of Poetry in El Salvador. So she's just very recently come. This is another piece of my presentation that I want you to know about. Poetry is a big deal, okay? Poetry is a big deal. It's not something that you have just little specialists. This conference lasted the whole month of August. The whole month of August. And where did it happen? In little back rooms somewhere where the poets gather privately? No, they happened in the public plazas, like we saw the picture of San Salvador. They happen in the schools, in the university schools, in the colleges, institutos tecnológicos. All of the towns and all the cities opened up for this conference and shared the poetry. So I think that tells you something in terms of how we look at literature, the place of literature in the US versus in Latin America or Central America, especially El Salvador. This was another local person who runs the Casa de Maryland, all the cultural events with the Salvadorian embassy. I asked her, what are you reading? Do you know any women writers? And she said, Hasin. Okay. I had not heard of her, so she.
You know the problem is that none of her work has been translated.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Very important writer.
Ah, well, I didn't know that, but I took this home and I put it on my bedstand and I started reading and I thought, oh my gosh. She writes, in a nutshell, if you've read Flannery O'Connor, it's creepy, okay? Creepy things can happen if you're living during a civil war and there's violence and very strange things happening, and somehow or other, she gets it into her stories, okay? So that's a name to look for, but thank you for letting me know, okay?
That's one of the problems, right? Like, there are some wonderful writers, but they haven't been translated yet.
Exactly.
And people identified, they have so many more books, and some that are just wonderful, but they haven't been chosen.
Right, they haven't been chosen. And another thing that's very problematic is that it's very difficult to get published. And Mario Ben Castro, who I'm going to tell you about, he is the first Salvadoran writer that I met, and what kind of got me started on this. He can't publish his own work in El Salvador. He's not allowed to. So then you go, oh, I'll publish in the US. We like books, right? Amazon. You try to publish in the US. Well, if you don't fit into a category, good luck. Okay, so Ellen mentioned the boom of the 70s, the realismo mágico. If you fit into that kind of category, well, now it's been popularized, right? Garcia Marquez, Vargas Llosa, that might sell. Okay, but if you're not in that category and you don't want to be in the realismo mágico box, then good luck. So I meet Mario Ben Castro, and I am blown away. I call him the man of many minds. I should say the man of many Mayan minds. He's incredibly well read, and when you think of going back to that original model of Europe and the New World, you might say, he bridges all of that space in terms of literature and art. He began as an artist, and during the Civil War, he became a writer. He began writing. So what's so important about Mario Ben Castro? And he's the only writer that I'm going to talk about now. Ellen really covered very thoroughly that area. So what do I want to tell you? Okay. Mario Ben Castro, I think, is very, very important, and I'll use him as my example because I think he follows in that tradition from Whitman, who sort of blew things apart. No more following European patterns. We're going to have our own literature. And what was Whitman's focus? It was inclusion. He talks about the shipbuilders and the laborers and so forth. So everybody's a part of America in his poetry. So that was a really important move. So in Latin America, you have all these writers who are responding to what Whitman did in terms of blowing open the possibilities for a new subject for literature. So here are some of the major writers that you recognize here, and I left off the magical realism folks because you already know about them, and that's a done deal. These are names that even in English departments, this is probably it that you might recognize if you're an English speaker. Okay, so what Ben Castro has done. Let's start with this. The Disparo en la Catedral, okay, shot in the cathedral, and this deals with the days around the death or the shooting of Monsignor Oscar Romeros. And it's so violent. I mean, he's talking about such violence and such torment, and yet he's managed to bring in different voices. So you have the whole community. You have the guy who runs the newspaper. You have the little folks who sell the tamales. You have the people who live in the country. You have students. You have writers. All of these people, these voices contribute to this work. And I was so blown away after I read it that he could basically, we're talking about memory here, cultural memory, and a very difficult subject. And he pulls it all in, and you're able to sort of re-experience and come out on the other side. And I felt like, first of all, that was such an exceptional act of writing in order to create the history and the memory. This is also translated into English. This is the second thing about Ben Castro that's really important. He has his work translated into English. Most of the translations he does himself. But so it's accessible. You have Spanish, so if you're a Spanish speaker, you can read the text, you can identify, and if you're an English speaker and you want to know more about this, it's available, okay? And you can find all this on Amazon now. Just a couple of other things. Odisea al Norte, You can take a look at these afterwards. El Árbol de la Vida, all translated into English. And
You should tell people, right, the fun thing with Odyssey to the North is that it's about the sort of first wave of Salvadorans living in Columbia Heights and Adams Morgan and the social unrest there, which is cool for students. And then the Book of Stories, right, the Tree of Life, is very accessible for students to pick selections from there.
yeah.
And the writing's magnificent.
What was the first title, I'm sorry?
This first one, yeah,
This one?
takes place in El Salvador. Odyssey to the North.
Odisea al Norte, yeah. And so this book, and I'm glad that you said that, because he's writing to the Salvadorians who have moved here and who live here. So it's almost like a personal text, okay? So you can relate to that. Disparo, and my favorite, Paraíso Portátil, Portable Paradise. This is a collection. There's a novela, there's short stories, there are poems. It's spoken from so many different angles, and you even have references to Maya culture. You have characters. For example, you have a protagonist who has moved from El Salvador to Australia. Who knew? Salvadorian communities in Australia. She joins a chat group and starts communicating with somebody. I think it's called Mi Tierra Linda, is the chat room. And she begins to communicate with this person back in El Salvador. And I can't tell you the I can't tell you the gist of it. But she begins to discover that she has actually known him before. And so it's in such a contemporary setting. Okay, so you have Salvadorians who are now in the chat rooms, using the computers. It's incredibly creative. That's just one example. His new novel, La Mansión del Olvido, this won the prize for Best Latin American Historical Novel. I think it was last year. Okay, so incredible. Big novel, right? All those big pages, yes. And then a recent book, this is a long poem, epic poem in 16 cantos, Waves of the East River, or Olas del East River. This I was the third translator on this one, so that was kind of exciting. So he does poetry. He does it all, basically. He does it all. You never know where you're going to find him, if he's in Turkey or Rome or China. This guy is on the move, but his writing is incredible. And from here, I think that's enough about him. He really covers all the bases as a writer, so we'll stick there. And now we'll go to the art gallery. Okay, Central American art, and I've picked some paintings from each of the Central American countries, okay? So here we go, to the museum. Oh, there's our poem. There's our man. Okay, I did a workshop at the DC Alt Translators thing, and they said, do you have a picture of him? And so I found I love that one. That's him. Okay. Okay, and Benjamin Cañas is a Salvadorian painter. This is, you can find this painting in the Museum of the Americas, 18th and Constitution. It's free. Great collection of Latin American art. Okay, it turns out that Cañas was the mentor of Mario Ben Castro when he was painting. And Ben Castro has written a novel based on this painter who was well known outside the US, okay? And the topic here is Kafka. It's based on Kafka y las cartas a Milena, Kafka's letters to Milena, okay? So again, Ben Castro is using this painting as a cover of a book that he's writing. Okay? Ben Castro also just moves sort of fluidly between painting and writing. And there's a little close-up, and there's Kafka. So Ben Castro, when I say many minds, he's also very familiar with Kafka and this relationship. So that makes it kind of exciting. And there's Letters to Milena, okay? Again, the literature connection with art. Art of the Americas. Again, this is a recently published book of their what do you call it? Their home collection. Okay, so I recommend that you go there as a resource for art. I put this in Asilia Guillen from Nicaragua. She was actually brought to the Pan American, at that time they called it the Pan American Union. That's now the AMA Museum, and this is her painting. Originally, she worked in embroidery, and her designs were very wonderful, and she started painting. This one, I think, sort of says it all. Efraín Recinos, Música Grande, okay? Museo de Arte in Guatemala City. This one just, it's sculpture in wood, a product that you might find a person working with commonly in Guatemala. Okay, Rodolfo Abularrash, Orfeo, okay, also Guatemala. Okay, apparently he did a lot with engravings and with mythology. Cecilia Paredes, Costa Rica. This is from a collection at the World Bank, which is another in DC. The World Bank has great collections of art from around the world that we don't get to see. Okay, I got squeezed in because I knew somebody. But so to find, there are pockets of Latin American art. It's usually incredible, but you have to kind of find where to go. This one I loved, June Beers, Nicaragua. And June Beers was from the coastal side of Nicaragua, where there were a lot of former slaves or escaped slaves. And she paints about that, the culture that's there. Okay? And she was self-taught. Alan Arguello, Nicaragua. If you've traveled in Latin America, you probably recognize the little paleta cart. And my favorite, this one's called Evita, and she is the woman with the duster, the one with the duster. Okay, and the photographer, the artist, is Sandra Eleta. Sandra Eleta. I saw this one. She also paints, she's from Panama, and there's a culture on the coast, again, a community where there were many former escaped slaves, and that community has stayed intact with their language. This is one of my favorites. She's so regal. And of course, she's sitting on the tacky furniture that she's probably just finished cleaning. Okay, and this is Honduras. And let's see, I'll have to, I can't see my slide where that, but this is Honduras. You see the landslide, and you see the attention to detail, the animals and the life, and then you see in the white on the left-hand corner, that sort of white area, that's a mine that sort of blasted along the side of the. That's the art for today, and a reference to literature, and that's it.